So welcome. This is, of course, the final week of the course, and we're doing March Book 3. We did the first two, of course, the previous 2 weeks, and we're actually joined by Nate Powell and Andrew Aydin, who are co-creators. I would actually say co-authors, because illustrators are also authors, in my opinion. And we're also joined by Bruce, who is sitting actually on the drawing chair, it looks like there too. But I'm thankful for y'all taking the time to actually talk today about the whole trilogy and specifically book 3. So thank you for being here.
You bet. Glad to be here. I'm gonna actually run and get my copy of book 3 right back here.
I do have it pulled up actually online too. But I mean, I guess they read an article by Lessons in Graphic Nonfiction, John Lewis, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell's March Trilogy and Civil Rights Pedagogy. I mean, I know y'all see a lot of these kind of articles coming out if you read them or not, but I've talked to you before, Andrew, kind of about the idea for this book. And book 3 ends with kind of the genesis for the book, right? It's kind of this meta moment where you're talking to Representative Lewis about actually wanting to do it. And he's like, okay, let's do it. But can you kind of talk about what you envision for this trilogy to be, you know, within the classroom?
Well, I mean, I think originally it wasn't a trilogy. You know, I think one of my favorite stories that gets lost in this is Nate and I standing at San Diego Comic-Con booth, the top shelf booth, which, you know, it was back in the day, it was just like tables as like a oval, right? And we had a mini comic and we were like giving it away. And I remember standing with Eddie Campbell because Trisha Helfer was at the table across the way and we were all like, hi, you know. And finally, Nate and I had like really had like a heart to heart with like, okay, this is a big story. How do we do this?
And this is the first time we met in person, by the way, too.
Yep. We've been, well, how long have we been working on over the internet? Like 6 months?
We started in like mid 2011, but we didn't get a whole lot done until 2012. So we'd really been in the thick of it for about 6 months.
And see, that's another thing to point out, because I've seen a lot of comic teams or graphic novel teams that's the same story, right? That you're working remotely or, you know, distance. Like some people may be in Europe and some people here, and then you're working together, and then you don't meet in person till later. But just kind of a side note, sorry.
No. Yeah, I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, the old New York studio shop days are kind of gone.
For sure.
But we were just sitting at the booth talking, like trying to map it out. And I think at that point, the script was like 350 pages or something like that.
Yeah. And what I had already signed on board, and basically I did a read through of everything and just kind of roughly marked up the script based on what I thought was going to be my own pagination based on my sense of rhythm and flow. And I remember, this is going back to like 2011, writing Andrew a couple of days later being like, really excited. Thanks for having me on board. Just so you know, I read the script for this book, March. It's going to be great. Looking forward to it, but it's going to be about 600 pages, not 300. I hope that's okay with everybody. And at the time we were all like, yeah, sure. Let's just make it this giant brick.
It's a big Craig Thompson book.
Exactly. And then at 2012 Comic-Con, we were basically like, this was the first of a series of decisions which had nothing to do with the format or the ambitions or the scope or scale of the book, but which later determined the path of March. We were basically like, 600-page brick of a book, just to take the pressure off a little. Why don't we break it up at its natural narrative points and just make it 3 books? And we're like, yeah, that'll be fine. And really, it was that simple at the moment. Little did we realize that, like, you know, our ability, but like all readers' ability to benefit from what is now dubiously known as the Harry Potter effect, like the ability of readers to grow into reading that gets denser and darker and more complex. Yeah. None of that could have happened if March would have been a single 600-page brick. And, you know, the ability for 4th graders to read March Book 1 in classes could never happen. Like, really, the ability of March to really become a part of the fabric of our education and our national conversation, it owes a lot to Andrew and I just being like, let's take a bit of the pressure off.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you notice they go from this, like you said, to this.
Well, part of that is also that as Nate and I started working together and we worked with Lee and Chris Ross, there were things that weren't in the original script where we would be researching and be like, oh, we've got to include this too, right? Because the first book is so much about John Lewis's telling, right? It's him telling the chicken story. It's him telling his first meeting of Dr. King. These are not things where there are primary sources.
Right.
But then as we got into book 2 and book 3, these were events where they were well documented and there was research that we were uncovering like in real time, because
Yes.
at the same time, Bruce Hartford at crmvets.org was putting up these primary documents
Phenomenal
as they were
site, by the
coming
way.
in from SNCC volunteers who were digitizing them from their basement. So then we would be like, I remember like it was like the Council of Elrond in book 3, right? Where like that whole scene was very, very, it didn't really exist in the original. And then we get the meeting minutes from it, and we're like, oh, we can explain. Nate calls it the Council of Elrond. I should explain that because it's this long, like talky,
There
like
is that
way too
Fellowship
much
of the Ring
exposition,
reference,
right?
I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, right? But we had the meeting minutes, so then it's like, oh, we can say this in their voice. So then it becomes, what was that, like a 6-page scene?
Yeah,
right?
about that.
And that's part of how March would grow over time. And then also, I mean, like it started too with the first samples, right? Nate tried to do it like linearly with our script version, because this is the first script I'd ever written. And then there were some parts where it was like, okay, we got to keep it in John Lewis's voice, so we need to change that back. And Nate was like, okay, let me take another crack. And then he brings out more panels, he adds the drama, he does different camera angles, and actually spreads that what was 1 page into 2 page. And then that's also how it grows as we get more just familiar with John Lewis's story. And Nate really came to understand it in a way that I think people refer to now as cinematic, but I think of it as like where you really see this through Nate's mind's eye.
So I want to back up real quick. I was trying to interrupt you. I apologize. But so CRM Bet isn't that old? I mean, it's about the same.
I think it started maybe 10 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. See, I've been using that site a lot. I mean, the We Charge Genocide, which I think I mentioned in my class before. I was actually teaching Fannie Lou Hamer today. So I was looking up HB, I forget what number it is, but the one that was basically going to imprison people for having more than one kid. And there was a SNCC pamphlet about it, right? So pulling those things up, and which actually leads me to a question, because you mentioned, we know that it gets thicker in the first book, focuses on Lewis and those kind of first person narratives. What are some things or individuals that through your research, you were like, I want to add this, but we can't, it's just too much, right? I'm sure there may have been some.
Can you repeat that for a sec? You
That's fine.
froze.
So like, what are some things, because if you added everything with the movement, I mean, I've started digging in more too with different things I'm doing with the Lillian Smith Center and elsewhere. If you added everything, this would be more than a brick. It'd be like 10 bricks or more. Sure. So like, who were some individuals or kind of some events that you had to leave out because they just did, because they weren't with Lewis, for one, because it is his focus, but it does expand to others. Yeah. So what are some things that kind of got left out possibly, or that you wanted to include but couldn't?
Some of this changes like post March. Like I'm still constantly reading about the era from different people's perspectives, and it's incredible. Like right now, reading Begin Again, that new book about James Baldwin's reflections through his writing and in his life on America at the time, and his movements across the Atlantic and back, and then The Sword and the Shield, the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In each of these books, it's just riddled with these moments and passages where I realized that this is like an endlessly telescoping process of learning more and then being aware of more minutia and more vantage points. But yeah, I think the great dividing line simply had to do with being more conservative as, like, in an editorial sense, being more conservative with the inclusion of material that was outside of John Lewis's direct experience. And the big moment actually that made us realize we needed to have a system for this was because, yeah, kind of going back to the subjective nature of March Book One, not only due to it being more memoir based and being more based in his childhood, but the early moments of the movement being much less documented. So like the history of the movement through the 3 March books and Run is also the history of the increasing documentation and broadcasting of the movement to society at large. And so with that documentation comes a higher level of accountability and a higher level of responsibility when figuring out how much of the picture to reveal. So a lot of the story is here on the front cover of book 2. This is the cover as is based on my original favorite cover sketch, which we were all into and contributed to. I did it. We all signed off on it. But Congressman Lewis was thinking about it for about 3 months, and he came back to Andrew and was like, hey, you guys, like, I don't feel so comfortable having the Freedom Riders bus outside of Anniston burning, because even though that was my bus, I wasn't on the bus that day. I was returning from this trip to Philly. And basically he's like, since that's outside of my direct scope of experience, I don't know if that's appropriate. So I was like, sure, I'll do another top half. And we were like, yeah, that's fine. And we approved it. And then importantly, it kickstarted this conversation where we realized that in order, basically the narrative mission had changed between these 2 books. So that to tell the story fully and appropriately meant stepping outside of the limitations of young John Lewis's first person experience with book 2. So I think it arrived at a point where the congressman realized he had to accept that we were going to be telling history that he couldn't be on the ground for. And so Andrew and Congressman Lewis shifted some of their narrative focus so that they were more explicit from halfway through book 2 onward when describing events that he couldn't be there for because he was in jail or because he was in a campaign in a different state, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like to boil it down too, right? Like there's this idea of so many books are written about, like Nate referenced, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I think it would have been really easy for us to lose John Lewis's story if we went and tried to tell the full depth of what they were doing, but we limited it to how what they were doing impacted or intersected with John Lewis, right? And it's Malcolm meeting John Lewis in Nairobi, Kenya in 1964, meeting John Lewis in Selma, like those sort of interactions, and narrowing the focus and trying to provide John Lewis's perspective on what happened. And that was always a tension too, of like, in those instances, we had to tell rather than show. And I think the other storytelling device is that, those would become narrative as opposed to in the moment visual scenes.
Well, I was going to say, go ahead.
Well, significantly, when we're talking about choosing what to limit or what to exclude, for lack of better words, there are also like legal and practical considerations. For example, quoting anything from Dr. King that's more than a sentence can get very complicated and very expensive. So you may notice that like the letter from the Birmingham jail features a sentence. And you may notice that we made a very deliberate choice, all of us together, not to reproduce any part of the I Have a Dream speech. And part of it was in order to not have the other components of the March on Washington be overshadowed by I Have a Dream, but also in order, as Andrew was saying, to shift to John Lewis's reflections on the moment and its significance in a way that was not falling back on the I Have a Dream speech itself, and also sidestepping the need to possibly pay tens of thousands of dollars to get access to reprint those words.
And there's a couple of things you mentioned there. One, I love the fact Malcolm X comes in with one of those splash pages with this kind of description of them in book 2, I think, and maybe one more page. But I loved rereading book 3 because it's been a while since I reread it, but seeing actually Malcolm X there. And I won't say demystifying, but challenging that narrative that we see that King and X are against each other, right?
For sure.
You know, they're fighting for the same thing, because we boil everything down, as y'all pointed out, to the 9-word problem, for one. And this is expanding that, you know, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. And then we kind of balloon out with this book. And that's why I like Run too, bringing in Stokely Carmichael, because I think that I had an edition of Black Power, but I think I started reading it before Run came out. But even looking and seeing where Stokely Carmichael's splits are, right, in kind of those discussions, and he's in here. But that leads me to another thing too. You were talking about, Nate, when you were talking about actually reprinting the speeches. And one of the things that stood out to me as I read this, like I said, I've been reading Keisha Blaine's Until I Am Free, which is the book about Fannie Lou Hamer. And you basically reprint, I think, almost the whole thing of her speech in front of the Credentials Committee. And
Yes.
you talk about it, and I want you to talk about this scene, but some things that I really love about it, you actually point out too, where Roy Wilkins, I believe, calls her ignorant, right? And you point out that comment that she made to Herbert Hoover too, which I just read in the speech that she gave in 1968. She talks about that. She's like, you know, I basically told him, you know, you're thinking about yourself and not the 400,000 Black people in this nation, right? So those are powerful, but talk about the speech, but also, can you talk about your movement here? Focusing on her
Certainly.
hands, focusing on the media and everything too. So it's kind of a broad kind of discussion.
Well, a lot of this, first off, yeah, sort of bouncing this back to what we were talking about, you know, with access to people's speeches and the different tiers of difficulty. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony here is publicly available, and so it was not a problem to reproduce. It was more of a narrative challenge to have her direct testimony in the room, to have the remote scenes happening minute for minute with Lyndon Johnson in the White House, and to have these sort of narrative asides of what she was describing. But March Book 3 is also very much about the mediation of the civil rights movement in real time. So it's important every time we have a camera involved, every time a TV screen is involved, so that it's inevitable that by the end of this scene, you know, Andrew had constructed it so that these two parallels from the White House and from New Jersey and from the Democratic National Convention are going to collide as LBJ makes the decision to just shut down her televised testimony and just make up whatever on the spot and just run his mouth to run out the clock. So for me, at the time, you know, in 2015, putting this on the page, a lot of it had to do with following through with what we felt was the primary focus of Book 3, which was largely to shine a light on then still underserved by the mainstream as far as voices and figureheads in the movement, but particularly the Selma movement. And so a lot of it was just challenging myself to step into Fannie Lou Hamer's shoes and recognize what it would be like to sit in front of those cameras to tell this horrible story, and you know, to set your bag down and to give yourself a minute before you begin your testimony, not to be able to see the faces of anyone because of lights and because of cameras. A lot of that is just like the joy of making comics, is forcing yourself to walk around in a situation and be able to pull out details which will allow a reader to really understand what her human experience was in that moment. It's not, you know, a lot of it is about us reading and absorbing her true account, but then the next layer of that is us understanding what it means for, you know, a local activist leader to step onto a national stage, and you know, with such vulnerability and such courage.
And she's actually running. Is she running for Congress at this point too? I think she is. I don't
think so, but Andrew might know.
She was a delegate at that point. I thought she ran in '66. You'd have to check me on that.
It may have been, because I meant to check it earlier. I just didn't. But I like the fact that you mentioned her hands, because you have like multiple panels with her hands on the table, right?
Well, it's always a decision, especially with a talking head sequence like this, where obviously the dominant, like the inflexible component of the storytelling is all the word balloons to get all the writing in. And if that's a given, an inflexible given, it's a matter of how to break up the monotony of, how to avoid just having her face talking the entire time. And it's a very basic comics problem or comics challenge, but the important thing is to allow yourself as a storyteller to look around and see what else is present on the scene.
So why is this speech important, Andrew? Why include this? I mean, y'all talk about moving out, but what's so important about her speech, kind of historical context wise?
Well, first, part of our mission was Fannie Lou Hamer at that time was not as widely known as we felt like she should be. There's a coterie of women that we tried very hard to highlight, Ella Baker as well, and others. The speech itself, though, is so important because you have to understand it as like this major turning point in the movement, which is the antagonism towards the administration. The administration has sort of been seen as a sympathetic referee. But at that point, when Fannie Lou Hamer gives this testimony, the way that she directly confronts the Johnson administration and the way the Johnson administration then pushes back, you have to understand that speech to then understand the significance of Selma and then the Johnson administration's response in Selma. Because when you take Selma in isolation without an understanding of what happened at the Freedom Summer and the party challenges, and that this was about challenging the mechanisms and the levers of power, and particularly having Black women be at the forefront of it, right? You go to Selma and it's Amelia Boynton and it's others like that. It was one of the ways in which the battle lines were drawn. And part of it was also, we had this in mind that later we would start talking about the 68 Democratic Convention. And I don't think we'll ever get to that point. But you have to understand the 64 convention to understand what happened at 68. And in particular, you have to understand Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. And so it's all wrapped up in that. Plus, I mean, just imagine the courage that took for her to talk about those things.
If I may, like it's important to read LBJ's breaking in on the talk.
What page?
Oh yeah, it's on right around there. You go. So it's important to simultaneously read this as like, it's like, whoa, like John, like the limits of Johnson's support for the movement when it cuts in on his own self-image and his own political ambition and his own ability to control the situation. So this is a major like people power moment here by her testimony, but it's simultaneously important to recognize how much this testimony shook the president of the United States, that he felt he was forced to do that in order to stop her testimony from hitting everyone. And then if you move forward, I know you have the page on here. One more. There you go. Go back one. Boop, this one right here. This to me is one of the most important pages in the book. After their testimony, the delegates went back to their hotel, and that's where they learned that he intervened in the telecast. And obviously everyone was really pissed off, but then everybody's like, hey, look, but President Johnson's gambit backfired. Networks that cut away to cover the press conference made up for it by leading the evening news broadcast with her testimony. And so now going back into the mediation of the history, we're finally watching someone who was just on TV, watching herself on TV, replaying the events that we as readers just experienced a few pages prior, but she is really absorbing the significance of that moment at the time. But most importantly, what she's saying here, that's why I like that song, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I feel like I'm talking to the world. And just to imagine that sense in that moment of recognizing that the growing recognition that she actually shook POTUS to his core And a series of missteps magnified the impact of that moment. But really, it was a matter of her speaking her truth and her not putting up with the nonsense anymore in that moment. Like, I love that page, and I feel like that's the real core of that scene, is the epilogue there.
Well, I love this page too. Like I said, I just read this in her speech in Kentucky when she talks about this and what happened when you have Hubert Humphrey there, you know, telling her to take the two, I forgot what they're called, but basically take the two non-voting votes. Because it'll help him get to be vice president. And she's like, no, you know, and she says in her speech, I'm thinking about you're not thinking about the 400,000 Black men and women and children in Mississippi and elsewhere, right? But I love this panel here, the way you depict him, just kind of as I would say sniveling, kind of just like pathetic. Yeah. Oh, but it's my privilege to be this guy, right? And then she's like, I'm going to pray for you.
Yeah, which, like, as Southerners, we all know that I'm going to pray for you is like one of the coldest things you can tell somebody.
It's bless your heart.
Yeah, it's bless your heart with a little extra zing at the end.
But you have kind of this image of Humphrey here, and I don't think it's Bull Connor. Is it Dallas Clark? It's somebody who has kind of a similar type of face during one of the showdowns.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, in terms of like classic cartooning, like, there are moments where you have to lean into some of the physiological, you know, some of the just like standards of cartooning, but by drawing down and diminishing the chin, and by, you know, like adding these, like, a lot of that is like turn of the century, late 1800s cartooning to show, you know, to show like a lack of integrity, or you know,
so
a lack of a spine.
So could we move forward just a little bit to 65 and Marion?
Yeah.
And the reason I want to do this is because I realized something when I did book one, that it starts off, you know, on Edmund Pettus Bridge with the march, right? The first march. And I know that was spurred on from Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder, partly, right? And we just finished Darkroom. I'm not sure if y'all have read it, and you may have, Weaver's Darkroom. So Leila Quintero Weaver, it came out in 2012, so like 2 years before March book one. And she's an Argentinian immigrant. She came when she was 5, and her dad was a photojournalist, and they were in Marion. And she's talking about being a Latino in the during the civil rights movement in the South in Alabama, right? And it almost ends, not totally, but it ends basically with Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder. And we don't go into the building, we don't see it. It's just that a shot was heard, right? So bookending that, reading Darkroom, and then starting, and there's no indication that the march starts, I think, in Darkroom, but bookending that with what happens at the 1st of March, I think was a good kind of pedagogical thing that I didn't plan, but I think that worked out well. But you don't present Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder until book 3. So, and you do move back and forth. So can you kind of talk about that scene and why it comes so late, instead of foregrounding possibly that as the part of the impetus, at least somehow within that kind of opening narrative?
Well, I think so much of March book one really does have to do with Andrew settling in the larger framing device, being the 2009 inauguration scenes, which allows us as readers to travel through time, to travel through John Lewis's account of his young life and of the movement. But simultaneously, it's also a case of getting a lot of readers their vegetables as we go. So, like, you know, there's a summation, and then we dive in book one, but we do more skipping back and forth until we get to book 2. And then the second half of book 2 through the rest of the trilogy is pretty chronological. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we had gotten a lot more regimented, Andrew, at that point, because it really was like a matter of very methodically, but hopefully artfully, trying to get the sequence of events correctly and appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were always trying to balance, like, what was the best storytelling version of this with what was the most historically accurate. And when we would make those choices, a lot of it was based on this ethos that John Lewis carried with him his whole life, which is that he was able to teach people about the movement by being a great storyteller. And so I think narrative choices like that, if you did that, go that way, it wouldn't be as effective in reaching the readers. And I think that's what he wanted us to do almost every step of the way. You know, there was a couple places where maybe we shoehorned in more vegetables, but it felt like we had enough leeway to give the readers we wouldn't lose them.
Well,
And you know, part of it too is this is a really emotionally difficult book to read, and when you consider the narrative choices you make, you also have to consider the emotions that the reader will be going through, because if you put together something that is just brutally painful, they're going to turn away. You have to juxtapose that hope with the pain, and you have to allow them to experience all levels of emotion throughout the book, and not hit them too hard. I think that's one of the struggles when you're dealing with these painful moments, is like, what is the right way to do it, right? I mean, I think about Nate's version of Emmett Till, you know, how he did that.
Ethically, there was a very obvious balance we had to strike just right and maintain, so that we were depicting these moments of horror and violence unflinchingly, but also without the shorthand of comics, you know, exploiting the violence for narrative means. It's one of those things where I feel very good about the job that we did, but that's also why you don't see us rehashing moments to kind of iron in the significance of a moment. Is that, generally speaking, those moments are haunting enough as they are, and the joy of comics is being able to physically revisit these moments by turning the pages again. So we really wanted to limit our overhashing of a lot of the horror and trauma, and just allow it to sit as it occurred.
Well, like this image when they find Schwarmer and Goodman, right? And I forgot the other gentleman's name. I apologize. But just showing the muddied foot, right?
Yes.
And then even with Jackson, you know, going in there, like I said, Weaver doesn't show a lot. She actually doesn't show anything. But what page is Jackson on?
Oh, it went back. Hold on. It's about 138. No, around 140. There you go. Right around there. Oh no, that's sorry.
Not it. I know. It looks like.
I got you covered. This is a slightly different pagination.
FYI, I love the fact that in France it's "Wake Up America." I love the covers in France too.
There we go.
That's a side note, though.
Thank you.
But yeah,
like it's when you're talking about the depiction of this scene, Andrew, if I'm correct, the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson we depicted in specifically this way from the vantage point of outside Mac's Cafe, because of the lack of on the record eyewitness accounts from inside the cafe of the murder. So we had to do this a few times, like in a legal and ethical approach to depicting some of this. So you have the state police running in, you have some words in between them, you have 2 gunshots, but you mostly have, from a cartooning sense, you mostly have gestures that are showing some of the action, but this also ethically and legally puts us in a safe spot to depict what did occur without the appropriate on the record testimony from inside the cafe of what did occur. There's another moment from around page 15 of March Book 3 that depicts the murder of Johnny Robinson, 16-year-old kid, right after the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. And I remember while we were doing this, the sequence of events is never in question, but there is the survivor eyewitness testimony had a slight gray area as to whether there was 1 shotgun blast or 2. And so basically in order to straddle that line of subjective account versus an objective account of history, I basically just had to alter the lettering and sort of ghost out the lettering of the second shotgun blast so that it could be read as an echo down the alleyway, or it could be read as a second shot. And so these are moments that are historical ambiguities based on, testimony or lack of testimony. But as a cartoonist, you kind of have to find ways around it so that you can tell the story while remaining historically in the clear.
Well, and think about it too in the context of what we're seeing right now with the challenges to books, right? If we hadn't essentially walked that fine line and been so conscious of being as accurate as humanly possible, that's what opens you up to these challenges in our space. It's not necessarily what's making all the challenges, but in our space, that's how they would be able to attack the book.
Yes.
And we felt, especially after the first book, when we saw already be in schools, after you had, Michigan State and Marquette and Georgia State, and all these other schools using it as first year reading books, we realized the level of scrutiny we were under was the highest possible level. And that's why you have to approach it that way.
So there's a couple of things I want to bring up real quick too, because you mentioned about why you didn't start with Jimmy Lee Jackson. You started with the Bridge and the March. And one thing that reminds me of is the reading that the students had is how much physical media, photography, images we have, right, of the movement. And that's one of the most iconic, of course, images or moments of the movement, right? So, and actually being there, and you're not there for Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder, as we know too. But the other thing that I kind of think about too is when you went back to the 16th Street bombing, when you were talking earlier, Nate, about actually digging in deeper, and me as well, being here at the Lillian Smith Center, learning about her contributions. I just interviewed two people for our podcast. One was Joan Browning, who was 19 when she was kicked out of college for going to church with a Black girl, and became a freedom writer and involved with SNCC, right? And the other was L.J. Harrison, who was a history teacher in one county over, who took part in the 1960s sit-ins in Atlanta with King's brother and was arrested. And then, of course, the things he did afterwards teaching history. So just narratives like that, but also kind of these broader narratives, because I started digging into my hometown in Shreveport, which I'm sure you know where that is, Nate. The Shreveport Bossier area in Louisiana, realizing that King went there, in the 50s, and the backlash he was receiving. But also realizing after the 16th Street bombing, there was a church who wanted to have a service, and they had a service. And then either the sheriff or some deputy or something, D'Artois, ran in on horseback down the aisle during the service, beating people or, disrupting.
Man,
things like that. And he was one of the ones too, like two newspaper articles I found. One was him and some other city official went to the March on Washington. And then, of course, the report they get back was it's a bunch of vagabonds and, basically people who are poor and dress shabbily and all this type of stuff, right? Just very negative kind of response. But even learning that history, about where I grew up that I never learned about or knew about. So what these books and others do, expanding that 9-word problem.
That was the I grew up in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Congressman was my congressman since I was 3 years old. I went to Atlanta public schools. I went to the private school that would not let Dr. King's kids in. And I never heard any of what happened with SNCC. I never heard about the role of young people. I only heard sort of the 10,000-foot view of Dr.
Right.
King. And that was, they took us to the King Center every year. It was even in those programs and going to see that, they had these like kind of dioramas that you have in the King Center and things. It didn't explain to me what I wanted to know, which was how did it really work? Well, these were people. We had taken out the personal and we had made it
abstract almost.
Yeah, I mean, it was like it was a series of posters, but I wanted to experience the events, and I think that was underlying everything. And my mother would say, write this for this angry 9-year-old who was mad his father left, right? Like there's so many lessons we can take from this that stand outside of just the organizing or just the racial justice element, right? Like the idea of self-empowerment, the idea of standing up for yourself, the idea of finding a sense of home and community bonded by a common struggle. And I think, there's so many lessons you can take from the movement. I think for me, Atlanta is a town that has oftentimes tried to cover up its past and put a very sanitized face on it. And honestly, to be very frank and candid, as a congressman would say, I worry the same thing's going to happen to John Lewis.
Yeah, and it's not just Atlanta. I mean, we know.
Sure.
And I think that this leads us into that discussion of, your piece Shelf It and talk about book bannings. But, one kind of side note to that too, like I grew up in the South, I grew up in Louisiana, not knowing these things. Being the director of the center and learning more about Lillian Smith's involvement, like I knew she was connected with King. Like I knew that that King was pulled over that spring of 1960 with her in the car. He was taking her back to the hospital for cancer treatments, right? And Coretta was in the car. He was ticketed. He was put on probation, right? I knew that he was sent to the cab for the 1960 sit-ins because of that probation. So I knew kind of that connection when I first got here. But the things I found out since I've been here, learning more about Polly Murray and kind of her impact and the way Lillian Smith worked with her, learning too that Lillian Smith actually gave the keynote address on October 16th at that first kind of weekend SNCC conference before the sit-ins.
Wow.
I mean, like these types of stories, I mean, I think and it's not just her, like I know, but like Polly Murray, everybody, and then even going further back, because we book in kind of the civil rights movement with 54, and 65, and y'all move past that and run. But that kind of leads us to this other question, and I want to kind of pull this up. There's actually two things I want to pull up, because one of the things we actually started this semester talking in this class about we started with Jerry Craft's New Kid, and the reason I chose that book is because there was a school in a district in Texas that was trying to ban it, right? So it's like, we're just going to start with this book. They tried to ban it last October. And then it turns out as we're working through the semester, the county in Tennessee we're going to ban mouse, right? And then your piece comes out, Nate, about that. Can you kind of talk about this a little bit? And there's one, both you and Andrew, about kind of the book banning and kind of these discussions, but there's one panel in here that, I want to kind of pull out and kind of end with.
You bet. I mean, a lot of this was recognizing, in real time, not only what had happened within that county school district in Tennessee, but also recognizing that it was one piece of a wave of book bans and book challenges, which had specifically focused on graphic novels starting in May of 2021. And so to us in the comics world, this was not a one-off thing that happened that was shaking people up. This was a larger step in a movement we had been paying attention to for virtually a year. And importantly, recognizing that basically trying to take the like a commodified value, like an exchange value for the content of any of these books off the table in comparison to each other. Because the fact is that while a lot of books, books that were like the mouse ban was huge and horrible, and Art Spiegelman himself immediately recognized and publicized that the vast majority of books that were being banned, specifically graphic novels, were either centering the voices of or by LGBTQ creators, right, and or Black creators. And so at the same time, we recognized that, number one, March, while it had been challenged and banned in a couple of prisons and challenged in a few random, school districts over time, it wasn't on the chopping block yet. But recognizing that if you're watching this happen for 9 months, it's only a matter of time. And so that sort of made me recognize, like, there's this anecdote that I always gave about way back in 2014, when book one was only a year old. and a middle school librarian came up to Bloomington to my comic shop that I frequent here, looking for books for her school, and was there for 3 consecutive days and had skipped March every time. So when the shop owner questioned her, like, "Oh, have you heard of this book, March?" She basically cut him off, and like she knew all about March, but basically she was like, "You don't understand. If I get this book and put it in my library, I will get enough parental complaints that I may be fired." And yeah, she did not pick up March that weekend for her school. So it's the fact that like this is something that's been on our mind constantly that actually informed and affected how we wrote, drew, and edited the March books 2 and 3 to make March as bulletproof as possible, especially when March is the preeminent means by which an entire generation of young people learns about the movement. And it has an extra vulnerability by virtue of being a comic that functions as a different, a different medium, a different language, a different format from other books. It's easy to discount. And historically, it's always had all kinds of challenges. But the vulnerability of March in particular is that getting rid of March in the classroom effectively serves the goal of weakening and getting rid of civil rights education in the classroom, which is so hauntingly possible that it has kind of put us quietly on red alert for 8 years. And so I made that comic Shelf It to kind of raise the alarm ahead of time so that people outside of our smaller comics pond are aware that for those of us in the pond, we've been noticing for years, and it's important for people to really keep an eye out for what will occur.
Well, the one thing I wanted to say this real quick, because I talked to Stacey Robinson, the artist for Across the Tracks, right?
Yeah.
I taught that last semester. That's about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he made a point. He was like, we do not show muzzle flashes in here. He was like, I didn't draw muzzle flashes in here because I didn't want to give anybody any opportunity to ban it. Just something
Sure.
as simple as a muzzle flash, right?
Yeah. Well, that book also has a radical inversion of the typical narrative of the Tulsa Massacre, including my own comic from 2008. Yes. But I thought it was like, I'm using that word radical in a very earnest sense. The fact that 90% of that book builds up what Greenwood was, what the community was built on, and the people and livelihoods and the interconnection. And so like when you get to the destruction of that neighborhood and the attempt to destroy the culture and society, you really feel it because finally, thanks to that book, you understand what has been built up over time. Like it's radical in that depicting the destruction is not totally necessary in Across the Tracks to convey what is lost.
Yeah, there's only like 3 or 4 pages, I think.
Yeah, it's mind blowing.
I think it's also important to note the reason that some groups are targeting graphic novels as opposed to other books that are taught in schools is because I think there is the groups that are targeting these graphic novels recognize that there is still a contingent in the liberal establishment who looks down on graphic novels and will not support them as vigorously as they would support other books. We encountered this over and over and over again, where you would have Democratic establishment folks who thought, who John Lewis would tell me these stories about, like they thought, they still think I'm nuts for doing these comics. But then you would have folks like Patrick Leahy who would embrace it, or Tim Cook, or those folks. And they're taking advantage of that lack of understanding, that lack of belief, this sort of old-timey understanding of what literature is for young people. And they're using that to exploit these divisions so that then they can be successful. And then, as Nate said, if you attack March, you're effectively deplatforming the civil rights movement in schools.
Yeah.
Well, this is so old. I mean, we don't have time for this, but if students or people watching want to check out, I mean, going back to EC Comics and the Comics Code, I mean, they were doing preachies and very progressive things, even within their horror stuff, I would say.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's nothing as moralistic as a good horror narrative.
Right.
Nothing.
That A Little Strangers, when I go to, that's when I read, I was like, oh, this is definitely dealing with interracial intimacy and loving. I mean, this was like 10 years before Loving, but I was like, there's so these connections. But is that the reason too, Andrew? Why I don't have my copy of Run? It's behind you. But why in Run, like maybe a third, it seems like at the back of that book is footnotes.
Yeah.
It is your bibliography, your scholarly, recognition. These are the sources.
Well, the thing with Run is that there are so few other books written about that period of time. Hassan Kwame Jeffries and others have written some very good books that are focused on Lowndes County. But when you look at the overarching divide within SNCC, the struggle between nonviolence and Black Power movements, just in researching it, I had to go to primary sources more often than not, vast majority of the time. And so if we're building this narrative for the first time as a graphic novel, then let there be a record for it so that whoever comes behind to write in whatever medium it may be, let there be a record for them to use. And I think also in this concept, I got really frustrated over and over and over again for all the success that March had, of hearing people with tremendous influence say March wasn't a real book, or that March wasn't what they needed, or that that it was for kids or something like that, right? It's, you see these major news publications would say, it's a children's book, and you're like, no, man, like it's an adult book. It's just that it means it can be read because it's in this way by people who are 8 or 80. Like, we can connect everybody together. And so I wanted to put a marker down. I wanted to address that, and I wanted to prove that the scholarship that we were bringing to these books matches, if not surpasses, anyone else's work, hands down, full stop.
Yeah.
And that it also sets a bar, because everybody was starting to like look at all the books that you see now that have instead of it being volume 1 or whatever, or book 1 with like a Roman numeral, they call it book 1, right? There are so many things that we developed in March that people have now used all across comics and publishing. So I wanted to set this bar and let them try and copy that, because that's the most important thing we could add to the discussion, so that each graphic novel, each nonfiction memoir that came out in this space, or about any nonfiction purpose, would achieve that, would seek to achieve that same sort of pedigree at the end of the book, because that's how we fight back. I don't want to get into a shouting match on MSNBC or something like so many of these folks do. I want my work to speak for itself, and I want that to be what people aspire to, and to demonstrate what it looks like to achieve this high water mark. And then I dare them to surpass it. I want them to surpass it, right? Bring that sort of academic intensity, bring that sort of research, use the primary sources, let this shape the way we do nonfiction comics.
I think that's what's great, because I was talking with Tim Smith last week for book 2, and the assignments he has students do making their own graphic novels. And I've had students do it too, and provide me a bibliography. It takes so much more work to do that, and then to create it as well, than it is just to write a paper. You're thinking about so many more things, but you're mentioning that high bar too. I'm thinking about Rebecca Hall's Wake, right? I'm thinking about David Walker, and I forget his last name, Anderson's The Black Panther Party. I mean, it's done different than March and Run. Yeah. But I see Run and that book together. We're doing that for the Lonely and Smith Book Club in April. Just all of those types of things. And then even Infidel, or The Good Asian, right?
Well, we tried to do this for March, but they shot us down. Like, it just wasn't the space,
But that's what March does too. Even though you don't have that space, you have at the beginning of that the 2 kids who were shot. Students can look into them, right? Those incidents. You have Fannie Lou Hamer's speech. It's a space for students to look into Hamer and to look into her speeches. You have Malcolm X, and kind of not his total trajectory, but having them look at his speech in Selma, right? You give them the spaces to look, and they're not difficult to find with Google.
Yeah, but I think at some point, Nate and I we want to get together and put that together.
Yeah.
While we're still young enough to remember it all.
Yeah. Like we've talked about it several times over the last 5 years. And the funny part of it is, like, because it's going to be us doing it, is we recognize that it'd be about a year of, it'd be like a part-time job for
Yeah,
one entire year. So
exactly.
like that's been one of our major logistical obstacles, is recognizing that we've got 100 pages of back matter and reference to cover. But yeah, it has to be done at some point.
So let's end on this. And this could probably take us a while. We don't have a while, but I want to come here because this was in the article they read at the end. It's also in your piece, Stuff It. And it's also something we've talked about with Mouse. And it's these connections between the Holocaust and the Jim Crow South, the civil rights movement and all this. And you have this one panel here, right? And it is Stuff It, right? Shelf It, sorry. I apologize.
Yeah.
You have this one panel here that is Auschwitz, or it is a death camp, and it is the chimney. And you say we're living through a transitional era, losing everyone still in living memory of historical events from European fascism and the Holocaust to the reality of segregation and state policy. Like Joan Browning's like 70s or 80s. L.J. Harrison's like in his 80s. Andrew Young just turned 90, right? This is an opportunity for authoritarian and fascist forces to wage a desperate, sustained grab for power. And you're doing a little bit different things here, but you directly link it to the Holocaust. Yes. And then, of course, the article that they read for today talks about this page in book 2, going into Parchment, and how it looks like Auschwitz with the guard tower. I mean, you see that it's a sprawling field, but kind of that image. And the article kind of says that it seems to be shoehorning it, but I would say it's not. There's no clear connection within March, but how do you kind of see these things working together? Because this is a broader conversation that teachers could have with March and Mouse together and with other texts.
Certainly. I mean, a lot of it is the direct historical link of Hitler being inspired by the Jim Crow South as a matter of policy and like incremental tiers to society and incremental redefinition of citizenship. In like starting with my book Any Empire in 2011. Since then, I've been very focused on the mainstreaming of extremes, not just ideology, but the mainstreaming of aesthetic and style, especially as a military child of the 80s, and sort of seeing it come to fruition. But importantly, a lot of the significance of some of these mainstreamed I guess what's behind a lot of the mainstream extremist aesthetic and style is the notion, I think it's most perfectly expressed with the blue line, black and white flag. It's the fascist idea of being more citizen than. And so whether it has to do with vote suppression to maintain an authoritarian or fascist state, it's not a matter of winning over voters when you can pick your voters. But in the case of Nazi Germany, to see it from, like a 15-year arc of history, it has to do with the incremental narrowing of defined citizenship. And by the incremental narrowing, the slow boiling of the frog, and that frog being what defines being a citizen of the state, resulted in the normalization of horrors, but also the erasure of groups of people. And I think that is the direct link that was taken from the Jim Crow era South, was the whittling away and the constant redefining of what citizenship guarantees, but also the pushing of uniformed state workers as being more citizen than any other citizen.
And this book, I've been reading this past few weeks. I mean, it's dense, but this book does a good job of explaining that. Saw Freelanders, Nazi Germany and the Jews, Volume 1. This is Nate's other, not that one, Any Empire, which need to reread. And I've also mentioned Robert Paxton's book to them.
Yes,
The Anatomy of
Fascism. Essential.
Right. And I'll share this with you on Canvas too, about face. This is the piece that Nate was just talking about. So what about you, Andrew? Any connections?
Well, I think it's always funny when folks write articles about March, and they're like, oh, well, they were trying to do this or they were trying to do that. And it's like, yeah, not really, but sure.
Well, it's death of the author. I mean, once it's out of your
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah. But like, I mean, like the scene you're referencing where it's like, that's just what the gates at Parchment
Exactly.
look like.
It's the kind of thing where that's a perfect example of like, there were moments throughout March where we would discover that something was way too on the nose. And so it was that classic moment. It probably happened 10 times where we're like, if you made this up and sent it to an editor, they would reject it.
Yeah.
Like having Jesus's face smashed out of 2 separate windows.
Which I like that.
Yeah. And
that's one of my favorite panels.
Like all kinds of complaints and stuff about it. That's just the way that shit went down.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the bleakness of this open farmland with Parchment and the guard tower and the fencing and the huge vacuum of space, like we can't make that up. Like we just have to present the imagery, and it's undeniable that these connections are going to be made. We actually don't have to do any lifting at all.
Yeah, see, this was it. Yet the analogy between Jim Crow and the Holocaust, Parchment and Auschwitz, as subtle as it may be, is also fraught because it threatens to obscure the historical specificities of each event. It might manipulate the reader's emotions by tapping into a trans-historical and transnational image archive, watchtowers, armed guards, fences. But my pushback, as you said and as I said, it's not trans-historical. Like you said,
right.
Hitler takes his inspiration from, and other Nazis from us.
Yes. and importantly, like I think what it really gets to is it makes people uncomfortable when they almost open that door where whether it's like the line people have determined they're incapable of criticizing, like questioning capitalism or questioning American exceptionalism. There are always these doors that produce so much tension that I feel like that's one of these moments that sort of could be taken by a reader as butting up against that tension and being like, oh, we don't want to go through that door yet, though.
It's easier to say it's other people and not us.
Yes.
And that's why one of my favorite quotes from Lillian Smith, her essay, The White Christian and His Conscience, there's 2 things from that, well, multiple, but she starts off by saying, ever since the first white Christian enslaved the first Black man, the conscience of America has been hurting. I mean, that's just a killer sentence.
It is.
But the other thing that she mentions too, what she's talking about is nowhere is hatred for the Nazis greater than it is in the South. Partly because their conscience has been hurting just as much. They don't want to look at it.
For sure.
And
also, it serves a purpose to have an externalized enemy, to have a mirror that's outside of your room. There's a sequence I do and save it for later that sort of outlines that outlines the vehement opposition to transatlantic fascists by proponents of fascist policy in the United States, because having an externalized enemy and having an enemy period is more important than any ideology which belies either side.
So let's end with this. Give students and viewers 2 books that you would recommend for them to read. Not just about the movement, any book that kind of influenced you or you're thinking about, comic, graphic novel, whatever.
Okay. Let me see here. One, I'll give a comic and then I'll give some sci-fi. The sci-fi I'm going to go for is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I slept on The Lathe of Heaven for like 10 years.
I've slept on Le Guin because I haven't read her yet. There's one book I want to read. I got her on my shelf.
Oh, wow. Well,
I know. Sorry.
She's an incredible author, incredible voice of humanity. But Lathe of Heaven sort of steps into the kind of trippy, kind of like multi-dimensional storytelling that telescopes on itself that I do in my fiction graphic novels. But everything that she does is based on power and humanity and people buying into and resisting systems of power that are visible and invisible around them. But Lathe of Heaven is magical. Comics wise, I would highly recommend Derf Backderf's Kent State, which came out last year. and is exhaustively
read that.
researched and just expertly drawn, and is an authoritative text on the Kent State Massacre.
I'm starting to read that one.
It deserves to win every award.
What do you have, Andrew?
I really liked The Vapors. If you haven't read that yet, it's about gangsters in Arkansas.
Is that a comic or is that a
My friend
comic
wrote
or
that.
book?
No, it's a book by a friend of Nate's.
Yeah, yeah. We were in punk bands that played shows together back in the day.
Is it kind of like Two Dead?
I mean, it's more like gangstery from the 30s. Like
we actually had some Hot Springs gangster
Wait,
scenes
is it-
that we cut.
Is it kind of like that Texas Blood?
I don't know.
Okay, never mind. That Texas Blood's pretty good.
Okay, yeah, no, it's like before there was Vegas, there was Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Yeah.
Hot Springs, Arkansas. I've been there a few times. Eureka
Yeah.
We
Springs.
have.
Yep. Oh, we've taken some vacations to Hot Springs. Anyway, okay,
Yeah.
so Vapors and what else?
I mean, if you want to go with graphic novels that were formative, just for reading graphic novels, I've always been an advocate for Box Office Poison by
I haven't
Alex
even heard of
Robinson.
that. God.
It was one of the honestly, I read that and that was the only reason I thought to early on reach out to Top Shelf when Top Shelf was still Top Shelf
That's a great book.
pitch March. Actually, Alex Robinson was the one who greeted me when I pitched March over the table at Mocha Fest way back in 2010. So anyway, it's a fantastic graphic novel. It's about him coming of age, like in his 20s, and
I wrote it down.
it was great.
I'm reading, I mean, like I said, I've been doing a deep dive into these connections with Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South. So I'm reading Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. That's a, God bless, it's a crazy book. Anyways. So I appreciate y'all taking the time. Bruce is all conked out, so that's good.
Oh yeah, this is party time. There we go, buddy.
All right. Thank you for taking the time with me today.
Anytime, you bet, man.
Totally.
Good to talk
All
to
right.
you.
Take care. Good to see you, Nate, man. Let's talk soon.
Good to see you. Count on it.